Now, so far, I haven't had many very good things to say about System 1. But System 1 is the one we live with. Because all our skills have the character of System 1. And skills, most of the things we do in life, we do very well. And we do it very well because we have a lot of practice. So we drive very well, and we're very good at recognizing our spouse's mood on the telephone. You know, I can tell my wife's mood on the telephone from one word, and I think everybody else can too, who has been married for a while. That's a skill. This is something that you have learned, you have practiced it a lot, and you're very good at it. And so System 1 acts automatically and delivers automatically behavior that in general is very appropriate to the situation. System 1, associative memory, is also the repository of our knowledge about the world. And it functions extraordinarily well. I'll give you an example, my favorite actually, from a study done when people were presented with sentences. They hear sentences on tape, and while events in their brain are being imaged and recorded. And one of the sentences is spoken in a British upper-class male voice. I'm not going to try to imitate that. And it says, "I have large tattoos all down my back." Okay, you laughed. That's interesting because in about a third of a second after that sentence, the brain responds in a characteristic way. The brain is surprised. And so what does it take? Think about it. It takes that you have to identify the voice as an upper-class British male. You have to bring up the stereotype of upper-class British males. You have to ask the question, do most of them have large tattoos down their back? Probably not. Surprise, that's an incongruity. It mobilizes, arousal goes up, System 2 is mobilized, people are trying to make sense. What is going on? That is extraordinary. You know, in terms of the speed and the efficiency with which associative memory works to generate answers to problems of that kind. Now, so in many cases, the answers of System 1 are fine, they're just perfect. And if we tried to use System 2, we couldn't live, because System 2 is much too slow. So when we walk, we couldn't decide with every step, is it safe to walk? Sometimes, maybe in the mountains, it may be important to do that. But normally, we just couldn't live that way. We couldn't move. We couldn't conduct a conversation if we stopped and asked ourselves about every word, is it the appropriate word to say right now? We can sometimes do it when it's very, very, very important, but usually we can't, and usually we don't. So it's perfectly okay, most of the time, for System 1 to guide System 2 and to control what actually happens. But System 1 has another characteristic, and I call it a machine for jumping to conclusions. And what I mean by that is that when a question is asked to which System 1 does not have an answer, or the answer would be difficult to get, System 1 proposes a solution. And the example of the roses and the flowers is a very good example of that. It's an example of what I call the substitution principle. And the substitution principle is that when we face a difficult question, quite often System 1 associatively has an answer to an easier question. Not quite the same, but related. And it substitutes the answer to the easy question for the harder one. And that happens quite a lot. And it sometimes can lead to absurd consequences. So the truth and validity is one. I'll give you another example. About 20 years ago, I think, there was a fair amount of terrorism in Europe, and there hadn't been any terrorism in the United States, so Americans were quite afraid of touring Europe because it was dangerous. There were terrorists there. And there was, at the time, they were selling insurance in airports. And so an experiment was run. I won't go into the detail, but the general idea with this, they offer different people two different policies. And some people were offered a policy that would pay $100,000 if during the trip, in case of death during the trip for any reason. So that's the insurance. And how much would you be willing to pay for it? That was the question. Other people were asked how much they would be willing to pay for a policy that pays $100,000 in case of death in a terrorist incident during the trip. Another question is, which of these two policies is worth more money? And the answer is absolutely clear. It's the second. Although, of course, this is absurd. I mean, if you die from terrorism, then you die. And so the second policy is included in the first. The first must be worth more. But actually, that is not the question that people answer. They answer the question, how afraid am I? Which is really a question that people very frequently answer when they're trying to put a price to insurance. And people are more afraid of dying in a terrorist incident than they're afraid of dying. And there's no question that this is true. Emotional response to death from an incident, from death in a terrorist incident is much stronger than to the general idea of death. So there's nothing absurd in the way that System 1 responds. It's perfectly okay to be more afraid of death in a terrorist incident than to be afraid of death. What is wrong is using that to value insurance. But if that is how we answer the question of how much insurance is worth, we're going to end up with this. Okay. A few more things about System 1. We think of System 1 as a network, of associative memory as a network, and that's very important. Ideas are associated with each other in a very complicated way. So if you think of a term illness, then it's associated with enormous amount of things, with nurses and doctors and hospitals and healthcare costs and old age and hangovers and vomit and many, many words are associated with that one idea of illness. That's the way it is. You hear the word illness, all of these other words are activated in associative memory. You're not conscious of them. But if any of these words gets whispered very faintly, you will hear it very clearly because you're ready for it. So associative memory, every instant of time, primes us or gets us ready to interpret reality. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. I don't know if it will work with a French audience, so pardon me if it doesn't, but well, let me tell you, it's very good in English, so we'll see if it works. I won't translate it. I'll tell it to you in English. But this is a personal story that happened to me a couple of months ago, after the book came out, and I was sorry because I would have put it in the book if it had come out in time. My wife and I went out to dinner with a couple, and later we went home, and so we're talking in bed, and she says, about the man, she says, he is sexy. Okay. And then she says something that is completely bizarre, but very clear. She says, and I'll go slowly, he doesn't undress the maid himself. He doesn't undress the maid himself. Okay? And I think she's gone crazy. I mean, what are you saying? He doesn't undress the maid himself? Well, it actually wasn't what she had said. She had said he doesn't underestimate himself. Now, but I heard, clear as bell, I heard he doesn't undress the maid himself. And one word creates a context, and you get very complicated interpretations which are completely biased by that context. This is the way that our mind works. This is the way that associative memory works. And notice what happens in this case. It's coherent. Things go together. So you are ready for a certain set of ideas, including he doesn't undress the maid himself, which don't make any sense, but they're related. But they're related to that theme. This is the way, I think, our mind works. It generates what happens with associative memory, as in this case. It generates an interpretation of the situation, and the idea is this interpretation makes sense. It's coherent. And there are two kinds of coherence. We speak of logical coherence, and that's part of the definition of rationality, but there is something else, which is associative coherence, which are things that go together. And associative coherence is a very rich concept. So, for example, emotions. To be associatively coherent means that if there are people that you like, you tend to believe what they say. And you tend to believe, and in general, if you ask for people, if you question why do people believe what they believe, it is really not because of the arguments. They believe what they believe because they believe people whom they like, and they believe the thing that these people say. I mean, this is true for all of us, for most of everything that we believe. This is how we believe. It is associatively coherent. And we have the feeling that the arguments come first, but as in the case of the roses and the flowers, it's not the arguments come first. If we believe in the conclusion, much of the time we're going to believe the arguments that lead to those conclusions. That's what associative coherence is. And another characteristic of it is that the confidence that we have in judgments, the probability that we assign to our judgments being true, in principle, it should be a judgment of the quality of the evidence on which our statement or our belief is based. In fact, it is not a judgment. Confidence is not a judgment. Confidence is a feeling. And we know where that feeling comes from. The feeling comes from the coherence of the story. If you have a story that makes sense, you have confidence in it. And if it is concrete, if it feels real, you have great confidence in it. And that goes back to the anecdotes that I had earlier. The statistics are abstract, they're somewhere else. But the individual soldier that I see, or our experience in writing the book, those are concrete experiences. They dominate the associations of System 1. So coherent stories are very important. parts, and what is not coherent we frequently tend to suppress. Now there is a very important characteristic of System 1 that I'll mention briefly, which is that it's the quality of the story that matters. System 1 automatically generates stories. And the stories tend to be causal stories, not statistical stories. They are causal stories about the particular case at hand. And I'll give you an example of how that works. In a study that was done, people heard a sentence about a lady who spent the day in admiring the sights in a crowded exhibition in New York. And later she discovered that her wallet was gone. She no longer had her purse or her money. And a few hours later, people think that the word pickpocket was part of that sentence. Now they didn't. The word pickpocket is not in the sentence. They had produced the word pickpocket as an association, as a cause. And that is something that our mind constantly does. It looks for causes. Anything that happens looks for causes. And it looks for coherence. And it turns out that that produces one of the significant aspects of System 1, ignore insensitivity to statistics, is that you can generate a coherent story with very little evidence. Actually, it's easier to generate a coherent story if you have very little evidence. And what impresses us, what gives us a sense of confidence, is the coherence of the story, not the amount or the quality of the evidence. And as a result, we find in people a radical insensitivity to the amount of evidence. It's the coherence of the story that counts. We are designed to generate stories from very little information, and fairly complete stories. And we complete the stories associatively. We make them richer than they are in some cases. All right. I could stop at any minute, but any moment. But I want to reach to a few points about economics, which after all I'm supposed to be talking about here. I'll talk about an illusion to which, or a set of illusions, to which System 1 is prone. And here is an example. Think of two football teams. And you think that they are really quite evenly matched. Okay? And now they play, and one of them crushes the other, 7-0 or something, a terrible score. And now they're no longer equally strong in your mind. One of them is much stronger than the other, because that's what you have learned from the fact. Now, several things are going to happen to you. One of them is you will not remember that you thought they were evenly matched before, because they have changed, and we think that now that we know that one of them was stronger than the other, it's not surprising that it won by so much. So there is that strange circularity in the reasoning. And what happens in this case, and in many other cases of the same kind, is we were surprised because we thought the two football teams were matched, but the surprise is immediately eliminated because we understand what happened. One of the teams was much stronger than the other. So the surprise is gone, and we have a new theory about the world. This happens all the time. And I want to say a few words about the crisis, the economic crisis, from an entirely psychological point of view. I have no economic opinions about the crisis. But what is very interesting about the crisis from a psychological point of view is that the very clear feeling that many people have these days that the crisis was predictable. It was not, because if it had been so easily predictable, it would have been predicted. So we make a long list of signs, that were available, and then people appear to have been willfully blind to those signs. And then we have all those people who say they knew that there was a crisis going to happen, and we believe them. We think they knew. All of that, much of that, is really nonsense. That is, what really happens is that those signs become very obvious because we know there was a crisis. So it really is like the football match. After the 7-0, one of the teams looks much stronger, and then, how blind could we be that we didn't see in advance how much it was stronger? This is hindsight, and it's a very, very pernicious phenomenon. And the other thing, which I think is quite interesting in terms of the use of words, is those people we say they knew there was going to be a crisis. That's terrible. That is really terrible. And what's terrible about it is using the word know. They didn't know there was a crisis. We use the word know for something, for a belief that happens to be true. But they thought there would be a crisis. And then there was a crisis, and now we say they knew there was going to be a crisis. But many people thought all kinds of things before the crisis. And it's only those that thought something that came out to be true that we now say knew there was going to be a crisis. This is really dangerous, and what's dangerous is that it promotes an illusion. And it promotes an illusion that you can know the future. Because some people knew, and all the signs were there, and what it protects is the illusion that the world is simple, the illusion that the world can be predicted. Nassim Taleb, my friend who wrote The Black Swan, Le Cygne Noir, he speaks of this in terms of the narrative fallacy. We can tell a story about the past, and because we can tell a story about the past, we get the incorrect feeling. We deny the extraordinary amount of uncertainty in the future. And so our capability for hindsight makes us vulnerable to a really serious illusion. I will tell you one more story, and then we'll open to questions. This story is about a study that has been going on for, I think, about 10 years in the United States, where every year they interview the chief financial officers of the major companies, I think the top 500. And they ask them questions about their expectations of the economy. And one of the questions that they have been asking since the beginning was to produce an 80% confidence interval for the value of the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, an index of stocks, 12 months from now. So that's what people are asked to do. And they do it. Year after year, they do it. Now, think for a moment what an 80% confidence interval is. When you're making an 80% setting an 80% confidence interval, you're in effect betting that the true value will fall inside the confidence interval with probability 0.8 and outside the confidence interval with probability 0.2. So you consider a case in which the value falls outside the confidence interval. It can legitimately be called a surprise. It's a surprise at the 0.8 level. Now, several observations about those chief financial officers and their predicting of the S&P 500. They have no idea what the S&P 500 is going to do. They're about as good at it as we were in guessing performance in officer training school, 0. In fact, slightly negative, actually. I mean, when they say the stock market will go up, it tends to go down, not by a lot. You couldn't make money by betting against them, but they have no idea. But what is most remarkable is they also have no idea that they have no idea. So now you can look at the number of surprises. And there, I think when I looked at the data, there was something like 12,000 or a little under 12,000 judgments. So you can see how many of them were realized and how many of them were surprises. And the rate of surprises, which should be 20%, is actually, I think, 63%. So the confidence intervals are ridiculously narrow, much narrower than they should be. That is a very important phenomenon. We call it overconfidence. People have much greater confidence in their ideas and in their beliefs than they have any business being. And it's a characteristic, it follows directly from the characteristics of System 1. System 1 tends to create coherent stories and to suppress alternatives, and it creates a guess about the S&P, and you can't imagine alternatives, and so you set a confidence interval that is very narrow and that bears no relationship to reality. And people make decisions on the basis of these estimates. In fact, there are differences between the firms with CFOs who are more overconfident or less overconfident. The firms that have CFOs that are more overconfident tend to take more risks. I want to close the loop to my first anecdotes. If you stop to think about those CFOs, there is a remarkable thing. Why do they keep doing this year after year? I mean, the same CFOs are being interviewed year after year. And so they should know that they had no idea. But they don't. They come back and they draw the same narrow confidence interval they did the year before. There is no connection between what they could be learning from experience and what they actually learn. To a first approximation, they learn nothing. They think they're doing something, but they're actually doing something entirely different from what they think. They think they're being logical, they think they have arguments, they think they have reasons for what they're doing. They really don't. And that, I think, turns out to be a fairly significant story because the world is full of people like that. In fact, the decision makers in the market and elsewhere have those characteristics. They are ridiculously optimistic. They're highly overconfident. They do not really know the risks that they're facing, which is one very good reason why they take risks. It's not knowing the risks they're facing. And they do not reason in the way that they think they reason. They think they're much more logical than in fact they are. So that's the story I wanted to tell you. How it relates to economics? Well, it's clearly not consistent with the rational agent model. And And it couldn't be consistent. I mean, the rational agent model is psychologically absurd. I mean, because it demands a great deal of, it demands complete consistency over the entire system of beliefs and preferences. And the kind of mind that I have been describing is obviously completely incapable of that. It is highly context dependent. It is narrow. It creates coherent stories. It produces associative coherence and not logical coherence. And so from that point of view, complete rationality, it's not that we're even approximating complete rationality. It's a beautiful system, our brain. It's just not like that. It does marvelous things, but it does not do the thing that it's assumed to do in the rational model. That doesn't mean that economics can do without the rational model. I don't see that it can. I think it's probably necessary to assume rationality. But in some contexts, it's useful to know the truth and the psychological truth, and it's different. So you can make assumptions and do very good things with these assumptions. But occasionally, it's good to remember that those assumptions are not valid. Thank you.